Okay, great. All right. So the previous session we looked at how things work in an organization, right? So what is a IT structure in a typical client organization? Who are all the key people that you could interact, from the client's team? Primarily the dev, QA, and ops, and the subject matter experts from the business team. Then we also looked at how are projects conceptualized, right? So and how was a vendor onboarded? What is the competitive bidding process? What are all the documents which come in as part of this, right? So primarily, we need to remember the statement of work, right? So which basically lists down the features and the scope of work that that has to be delivered as part of the system. Okay. Now, once the vendor is identified and the teams are onboarded, then you would start the project planning and then go ahead with the project. Okay. So we also learned about who are all the various roles in an IT company. So we learned about the delivery managers, the project managers, the account managers, on-site offshore teams. Okay. And then how are they structured? How are the interactions? What is the team composition? We looked at all that. Okay. I also gave you some basic overview about SDLC. Somebody yesterday requested to elaborate this about process in a little more detail. So let's do that. Okay. So we'll go into a little more detail about each of these phases. I'll explain this again. Again, what we need to focus is on where do we contribute, because we don't really need to know what the developer is doing or what an architect is doing in detail, right? So we should be clear about what our deliverables are, and you should also know what the other person is expected to do. Okay, how to do it, we don't really need to know about an architect or a developer and all. But as a business analyst, what is it that you would learn? And in a typical project, what are the phases, and in what phase would each of these activities would be done is something which you need to focus on. Okay, so phase one is where you would identify new projects, right? So typically, people in the organization would find out, okay, let's implement this application or this system. Let's build this system because now it will give us these advantages. They'll figure out that. Okay. Now, the activities which constitute all these, identifying opportunities and creating a business case for all that would comprise your enterprise analysis activities. Okay. Now this is the first area where you as a business analyst would get involved. The first step in a project is where you figure out, what projects to take up and whether it makes sense to take up those projects or not. Okay. Now, if you pick up any organization, they're crunched for funds. No organization, even Apple, if you take, right, has enough funds to take up any project, right? So you have to ensure that you pick up the best project which will give you the maximum value, and you would allocate budgets to that project, right? So this process of identifying the projects and then creating a business case for it is called as enterprise analysis, right? So you'll figure out, should I implement a new mobile banking app or a CRM system for my customer?
Raju, what did you just said? Process of identifying the project is called as
enterprise analysis. Right?
Enterprise analysis.
Yeah. So this is the first knowledge area which is expected out of a business analyst. So you will help out in this process of figuring out what projects make sense for your organization, right? And then you would also create a business case. So you'll not just say, okay, let's implement a mobile banking application, and then you'll have like a $1 million allocated to you. That's not going to happen, right? Now you have to substantiate. You have to reason it out, and then you have to put in a strong business case which will say that if you invest this $1 million for developing this mobile banking application, it will help your customers transact more, or you'll get more fees, or your customer base would increase, right? So some benefits you'll have to show which will justify that 1 million cost, right? So all that would be covered as part of your business case document. Okay. Now, once the business case is approved by the senior management, that's when the project budgets are allocated. Okay. So, which means, the senior management is giving you $1 million and then saying, okay, you go and start the project now. So that's where the project managers and then the identification of the vendor is done. Then the teams are onboarded. Okay. So the phase 1 is where the projects are identified. Then you'll figure out the high level scope of the project, and then the budgets are allocated. Okay. So that's the phase 1. So usually a BA gets involved here. Okay. So you would get involved in these activities. Now, how do we do that and all? We'll get into the details, as part of the course. Okay. At a high level, I'm telling you what you would do, how and where and all the details regarding that. We will cover it as part of the course. Right. Now, what we are doing is we are just understanding in a typical project what are the phases and who handles it. Okay. So that's the first phase. Now, once the teams are onboarded and budgets are allocated, right? Then what happens as the next step is the project managers sit together and then say, okay, now what, we need to complete this project in the next 6 months. Okay. Now let's prepare the detailed project plan on a day-to-day or a weekly basis. What needs to be done? What are all the activities? Who will do it? What are the dependencies? All that all the details have to come out. Okay. And where do we generally capture those details? That's captured as part of the project plan. Okay. So once the teams are onboarded, the first activity which is done is creation of the project plan. Now, who prepares the project plan? The project managers. Okay. The project managers would sit down. They would agree on the detailed activities. They would identify the estimates, timelines, and everything, and then create a comprehensive end-to-end plan, right from the requirements till it is implemented. They'll list down all the activities, who will work on those activities. So a typical plan would look something like this. Right? So you'll have this task list, what are all the tasks, and then the duration, when would it start, when would it end, what are the dependency tasks, who are the people working on those tasks, right? You'll prepare this detailed list. The project managers would prepare this detailed list. Okay. Now that's the second activity that is done in the project. Okay. So the first one is the enterprise analysis, which you as a business analyst would do. Okay. Then the second one is the project planning, right, which is primarily owned by the project manager, but you would provide inputs for all the requirement related activities. So what all activities would be there as part of your requirement elicitation, right? So all those details you will provide. So there is a role which a business analyst would play here. So requirements planning. Okay. So this is the second area where you would contribute. Okay. Then once the detailed plan is ready, the project managers would sign off that plan and agree that we will execute the project as per this plan. Now let's start the project. Okay. So the next activity, what happens is you will start capturing the detailed requirements. Now you have at a high level, what needs to be done, right? So we call that as a scope. If you have to give an example, like a mobile banking application, now the high level scope could be, you should be able to check balance or transfer funds, or maybe, you should be able to log in. So these are the things that, you would have listed down as scope. But it's not telling you the details about each one of them. What is the, how does a typical screen look like for transferring of funds, right? And what are all the prerequisites before that? And what is the detailed process for that? So that detailed requirement is still not there. So that is captured, that requirements are understood and documented as part of this requirements process, requirements definition process. Okay. So you would understand the requirement.
Yeah, Raju, like in phase 1 also we determine the project scope, and then in phase 2 we get into details of that project scope, right? Then we write business requirements, technical requirements, and whatever approvals are needed.
Yes. So here we are listing down what needs to be done. Here we are listing down, we are creating a schedule, a plan is prepared, right? So if you look at this, you're giving a start date, end date. So this was not done during your enterprise analysis, right? So it was only saying that whether to take up a project or not, okay? But the details are coming out as part of the planning, okay? And the next step, you are actually understanding each one of them. So when I'm saying, check your account balance as a requirement, as a scope, as a feature, right? Now, how should the screen look like? How should that screen look like? And where would the data come in? And what is the process for this overall requirement? And who can do it? All those details have to be understood, right? That is basically your job of understanding those details and then documenting it, right? So you would talk to the business team and then understand the requirement. We call that as a requirement elicitation. Then you would analyze and document them as well. Okay. So this is the fourth knowledge area that we would deal with, right? So basically, what you're doing here is, so you're picking up each one of those features, what was agreed upon, and then elaborating it, right? So you're asking all those questions to the business team, understanding the requirement, then you are documenting it. You are analyzing and then documenting it. Now there are some frameworks like use cases or user stories or ER diagrams. There are multiple ways in which you could document your requirements. Okay, all that is done using those analysis and documentation techniques. So the end deliverable of this is your BRD. Okay, so a BRD is created as part of your phase 2. Okay, then you take this to the customer would approve it, and then that's where the phase 2 is completed, which means your requirements are completely captured. Clear about this point till here? Are you clear about what is expected out of phase 2? Any questions, team?
What is the difference between business and technical requirement?
Okay, good question. Now, let's take the same example. When you want to, check your account balance on your screen, right? So there is a mobile banking app which we are developing, and there is a feature you want to check your account balance. Okay. Now, so the details about how the screen should look like, what details you'll show on the screen, right? And where is this information coming in from? It should generally come in from your deposit system, right? So how are these, from a business point of view, there would be a requirement. Okay, so functional requirement, we also call it as a functional requirement. Now, apart from this, there would be some other requirements which you have to comply with, like how much time should your screen take? Right? So now let's say you develop a system which is like fully functional, everything is there, but every screen would take you at least 15-20 seconds to load. You think that system would be useful? People would use that kind of system?
No.
Not really, right? So even though your system is functionally rich, is meeting all the business requirements, but technically it's not meeting the performance requirements, right? So upfront, you'll agree with the client. So what is the timeline that you're looking at? How many seconds it should take? So generally they will say, within 1 second it should pop up, and in the worst case scenario, it should take 3 seconds. It should never take more than 3 seconds, right? So you're getting that clarity on the performance. So similarly, some systems needs to be up and running all the time, which means, you cannot afford the system money, right? If Google is not working, it's losing out the revenue on those ads which are getting generated, right? So they would to ensure that the system is available 99.99%, which means maybe there needs to be an architecture which is like which is failover, which is taking over when the systems crashes, right? So technically you need to do something to make sure that it's available 99.99%.
Raju, our technical requirements are non-functional requirements?
Yes, yes. So some people call it as technical requirements, some of them call it as non-functional, but I would prefer the term non-functional because they're not purely technical. So there would be some operational requirements as well. Like some of the operational requirements could be your ability to automate your batch processes, right? Anyway, I'll come out to that non-functional requirements later in detail. For now, assume that it's all requirements that you are capturing. Some of them are classified from a functional point of view. What is the system expected to do? And some of them are non-functional, like you take care of the performance, availability, security is another thing, right? Now, at least applications like sensitive applications like your mobile banking or wherever money is involved, you want to be pretty much sure that you are not compromised. You are not allowed. Somebody does not hack into your systems, right? So you would clearly specify the security mechanisms that your password should be encrypted in this algorithm, or you need to have a secure connection. All those security related requirements would also come in. Okay, so all that constitutes your non-functional or technical requirements, as you would call it. Okay, finally everything goes into a business requirements document, BRD. All right. This is where you play a very important role. Phase 2 is where you spend a lot of time in the project. Okay, so you are the critical resource in this phase 2. A lot of it depends on what you are doing. Now, once the BRD is signed off, then there would be a technical architect who would be doing this design process, right? So you look at the requirements and then prepare the architecture. So should it be a 3-tier architecture or an MVC or a web service based? There are multiple, technical architecture formats, right? So we don't really need to be aware of it, so because we are nowhere related to a design activity. It's purely technical. Let the technical architect handle it. Okay. So only support that you provide is if these guys have any query or doubt regarding the requirement, they will come out to you and then ask the questions. Okay. So design happens. After that, the development happens. So phase 4 is where your actual programmers come into the project. So till phase 4, maybe in the first 2 months, you don't need any developer or a programmer in your project. Okay, so maybe the first 1 month you will capture the requirements, the next 1 month you design it. Maybe the third month you would get the actual programmers to start programming. Okay, so phase 4 would involve actually the development of the software. The programs are written in the build phase or coding phase.
Yeah, Raju. In design stage, like BA has no role?
No role. He won't play any role in the design phase. He would support these teams, clarify any questions they have regarding the functionality.
Okay. And like 3, 4, like BAs don't have any role other than if the team comes back to us to ask
Yes. That is all what he would do. So he will help them understand the requirements. Okay. So phase 2, you would be the master of all the requirements. You would be an expert in all the customers' requirements. You would have understood it from the customer. And 3 and 4, if the development team or the architects have any questions regarding the functionality, you will clarify that. Apart from that, there is nothing that you are significantly contributing. Okay. So that's what happens in phase 3 and 4. You do the design and development. The actual programming is done. And phase 5 is where the testing happens. Okay. Now, there would be a QA team. They would do the testing. They would integrate. See, the programmers would be large numbers. There would be at least 10 programmers in a typical mid-sized project. Right. Now, each one of them might have written some 2-3 programs. Okay. Now, so what we need to do is, after they have written the programs and tested those individual programs to make sure that they are working, you need to consolidate all those programs and then make sure that it's working as one single system. Right? So the 20-30 programs what are written, you need to combine them together and test end-to-end functionality. I'll give you an example. let's say there is a shopping cart application. So he would first register the customer, then he can select the products, then he can place an order, and then it is delivered. Okay, let's say these are the 4 modules. Products what he has chosen should be moved over to the billing module or the ordering module, right? So while each module would have been working correctly, there could have been issues while integrating with these from one module to another module. So all those defects are identified as part of system testing, and then you would resolve all that and make sure that the system is working end to end correctly without any issues. Okay, so this is done primarily by the QA team. Okay, now again within that there are 2 levels of testing that is done. One is the system testing, which is generally done by the vendor.
When you say in system tests we combine all end-to-end applications, that means like whatever is there, like if it can be 100 of requirements or
Yes.
or more than that, everything is tested in system test.
Yes. So whatever is written in the BRD, if there are 100 requirements, all 100 are tested in the system.
Okay.
Okay. So you'll end-to-end test everything and make sure that it is working and you have everything ready, right? So then you take it to the customer. So the customer would also have a QA team. They would do the testing and just to make sure that you cannot just depend on the word from the vendor, saying that okay, I have tested it out, and based on that he will not accept it. So he would also do 1 round of testing. Okay, he will also test end to end all the functionality and also the non-functional requirements like performance, security, and all. Everything would be tested, and once he is happy with it, once the acceptance criteria is met, he would give an approval saying that okay, we have tested this application. Now let's give access to the end users. So that is where the
UAT testing is like a beta testing.
Beta testing is a different concept here. Now, testing is basically you're testing the system. Now, beta testing would come in where
it's given to the customers for testing. So if the customer finds any fault, there's any discrepancy, then you go back to to changing everything how it goes.
Right. Now, so when I say the customer is testing here, the customer's QA team is testing it here, right? So it's not the end users are still not given access. So this is even before you go live, right? So which means nobody is using the actual system. It's only at the testing level now, right? So if I've prepared a mobile banking app, the QA team of the client organization would do the testing, right? So if they find out any defects, they will report it to the business analyst or to the QA lead. So these guys in turn would analyze the defect. If they find okay, there's a problem with the code, they will report it to the architect and then the development team. So these guys would fix it. Okay. So let's say you've started doing the UAT and there are 1,000 test cases. In those 1,000 test cases, you identify let's say 20 defects. Okay. So those 20 defects are sent to these guys, design and development team. Okay. So they would fix those 20 defects and then they would release a new version. Okay. So a new version would come in which would have all those fixes applied to it. Then the testing team would retest it again. Okay. They will make sure that those 20 defects are resolved and no new errors have come into the system. And once they are satisfied that all defects are resolved, then only they will give an approval. If there are defects, they are reported to the development team for fixing. Okay? Did that answer your question?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, great. If there are no more defects identified, then the system code, the application is given to the operations team. So the operations team would install it into the final production environment, as we call it as, and then give it. They would do any data migration if it has to be done. If it is migration from an older system, they will move all the customer order information maybe, right? Or if it's a brand new system, they will only create the new users. right? Who are all the users? Like if all employees of the organization are using it, they'll ensure that the user IDs are created for them, or, right? Any data which needs to be created, any operational setup which needs to be done, all that would be done by the operations team. And one fine day, they would give access to the end users, right? So this is called as go live. Okay, go live. Once on the day of go live, the end users or the actual users of the system would start using the system. Okay, so all that the functionality would be used by the end user team. Okay, so that's the process and then the maintenance kicks in. The support process kicks into it. Right. So this is the typical software development life cycle. Now, where do you contribute? You would contribute in phase 1, wherein you will identify the business case. You will contribute in phase 2, wherein you would help out in planning. You would understand requirements and document them. You will create the BRD. Okay. Then you would also get involved in the testing, wherein you would coordinate the testing, you would analyze the defects, all those testing related activities also you tend to get involved in. Okay. So these are the primary areas where you would contribute. So, but not all projects are taken up in the same way. Why? Because there would be different reasons, and so the SDLC model is modified a little bit to meet those requirements. Right? Now I'll give you some scenarios where the same model might not be very effective way to implement a project. Okay. Now, let's say you have captured all your requirements and then prepared the BRD. Okay. Now the BRD would capture the requirement, and then the architects would design and develop the system, and you take it to the customer for testing. Now the customer would look at it and then say, you know what, this is not what I was expecting. I had a completely different way of, I was visualizing it in a completely different way. Your way of from my understanding. Okay. Now those situations happen. How do you resolve that? Right. So in this model, it's difficult. Why? Because once you have approved onto the requirements, the client involvement is minimal, right? So how do we get that client or the business team's concurrence or agreement onto the requirements? So maybe during the requirements itself, we'll have to create some prototypes. You have to create some screens and then show that your final system would look like this, right? So we call that as prototyping. So there is some change of process here. So the SDLC process is a little bit modified to suit that context. So wherever you feel that there is a disconnect between the customer's understanding and our understanding, you tend to do that prototyping. Okay. So prototyping is one type of SDLC which has evolved. Okay. Then some projects could be very big. So it could take some 2 years or 3 years to so I was explaining the context where the project timelines could be long. If there is a 3-year project, right? So obviously 3 years the complete business changes, right? So you cannot, let's say the project would cost you some 5 million and it would have taken you 3 years to implement, right? So you obviously cannot wait 3 years to start using a system, right? So what do you do in those kind of situations? Right? So maybe we can take it up in multiple phases. You'll break down that system into 4 parts and then say, part 1 I will implement first with all the most important requirements. Part 2 phase 2 I would implement with the next important set of requirements, so that I don't have to wait till 3 years, right? If you have done it in like 6 parts, then every 6 months I would have something to use, right? So you can maximize the value derived from the system. So this is called as an iterative model. Now, depending on the context, the way in which you are executing the projects could differ.
What it is called?
Iterative model. Anyway, I'll come over to that detailed models in the following slide. I'm telling you that the key point I'm making here is one SDLC model will not suit all kind of projects. Okay, so that is where the reason that is the primary reason why multiple SDLC models have come up, right? So there is a waterfall model, which is the simplest of all. There is a V-shape model for high reliable systems. There is a prototyping model to get more clarity onto the requirements. There is iterative model to deliver projects incrementally and in a faster way. And then there is a spiral model, which is for high risk projects. You tend to take them up in a spiral model. There are product implementations wherein you have an existing product and then you just have to implement that to meet the requirement, right? There are agile ways of model, which is like Scrum model is one of the most popular ways, right? So there are like these 6-7 models in which you could work, right? Now, the way these models work, it's not similar to the same as the SDLC that we have looked at. So some part of it is different. Like iterative, you have a multiple phases coming in, right? Prototyping, you have some additional steps after your requirements are captured, right? V-shaped, your testing would be a little more elaborate, right? So there are different variations of this SDLC have come in. Broadly, the structure is the same, but some phases have changed a bit, okay, to meet that context. Okay, so let's spend some time understanding these various models, various SDLC models. It will give us a little more detail about in what all ways can a project be executed in. Okay, now before we get into this, let me clearly tell that you are not going to decide what model the project should be executed in. It is the project manager's job. Okay, it is not your decision to figure out which model to execute the project in. Okay, it's always the project manager's job. The reason why we are learning this is because we will be involved in these projects, so we need to understand how a typical project progresses, right? So knowing this would make you much more comfortable. You'll be able to relate your work and then say that we are doing this in this model because of these reasons. Okay, so it's nothing to do with the business analyst role yet. We're trying to understand the various things that everybody in the IT industry should be knowing about. Okay, so since most of you are coming from a non-technical background, I'm explaining it so that we are clear about this. Okay, so guys, in case you have any question or if you feel that I'm explaining it a little faster, feel free to interrupt me and ask questions or ask me to elaborate in a little more detail. Unless you're speaking out, I assume that you're understanding. Okay, and it's perfectly okay to interrupt me and ask questions. I would rather encourage that because that is how you would learn. If you just keep on to yourself, you might not get the further topics will become a little more complicated. Right? So don't aggravate the problem. If something is not clear, stop me right at that point and then make sure that you understand that. I can tell that 10 more times to till the point you understand it. Okay. Yeah. So the simplest of the SDLC model is the waterfall model. Okay. It more or less is similar to your SDLC model, what we have looked at in the previous screen. So there would be a enterprise or project initiation, right, and planning activity before requirement analysis, right? So then that would come out the requirement analysis. You'll do the requirements, you'll capture the requirements, then you will do the design, coding, testing, and then it would go to the maintenance, right? So if you look at the previous screen also, you have the requirements, design, development, testing, and then the implementation and maintenance, right? So the simplest of it is waterfall model. Now when do you use this? When the project requirements are clear, you feel that the requirements might not change so much. The project timelines are also smaller, around 6 months or less than that. You tend to execute them in a waterfall model. This is the best model because it's the simplest way, right? So doing one activity after the other activity, a very simple way of doing things. All your requirements are stable, clear, right? So there is no chance of requirements changing. So you don't really need to worry about it. So you execute this in a waterfall model. Okay. Now the name waterfall has come in because the output from each of the phases would go as an input to the next phase, right? So somebody felt that this looks like a waterfall, right? So that's the only name we have, that waterfall model. Otherwise, it has nothing to do with waterfalls and all. Okay. So yeah. So it's the simplest of all. This model is used where the requirements are crystal clear. You can capture that BRD right at the start, and then there won't be too many changes coming to that requirements. Okay. So pretty much what you have looked in the previous slide is a waterfall model. Okay. The next one is a V-shape model. Now, some of the systems needs to be highly reliable, which means you cannot afford a defect in your final production environment when you are using the system. Now, take some systems like let's say you have a news website, right? If there is something wrong, there is one link is not working correctly, right? Not a big deal. What are you losing? Nothing much, right? So it's not so critical for us, right? Even that system is that reliability of the system is not required there, right? So if you pick up a news website and one link is not working, maybe a few persons would have used it and they would not have looked into that news item, right? So it's a simple requirement, and even if that doesn't work, even if there is a defect, it is not affecting you much, right? But let's say you pick up an aircraft maintenance system. Now, let's say there is a feature for emergency landing, and that emergency landing functionality is not working. Okay? So that's disastrous, right? So that's that you cannot afford to have that functionality not working, right? It has to be very highly reliable. 100% of the time it has to work, right? So how do you ensure that those kind of
Raju, in that case, testing is a lot of testing is needed,
Exactly. So if you look at the V-shape model also, the testing is much more elaborate, right? Otherwise, it would have been a typical waterfall model. Testing and maintenance would have come in, right? So this would have been your waterfall model. You are doing requirements, then you are doing design, then you are doing programming, then you are doing testing and maintenance. But since some systems have to be highly reliable, you cannot afford to make too many defects there. You will make the testing a lot more elaborate, right? You will ensure that 100% of the time it works, right? Or maybe whatever the 99% of the time it works, right? So that is generally that reliability, if it is important for a system, you tend to have the testing in this much more elaborate way. I'll explain how it brings in that rigor, but you understand the context now, right? So if some systems are elaborate, then you will ensure that the testing is also elaborate and make sure that the reliability is provided to those systems. Okay. Now, what happens is first you'll capture the requirements, then you do the high-level design. So which means basically it tells you, what all modules should be there in your system. So if there are let's say, 3 modules, 1, 2, 3. So this high-level design would say, your system should have these 3 modules and each module should handle these functionalities. Then the detailed specifications would say, what all programs would be there in each module, right? And what all functionality should be done by each program. So that would be done as part of your detailed design. Okay. Then when you're doing coding, so each program that you have written in the detailed specification, right? So each program specifications what you have done would form the basis for your unit test cases. Right? So you would map your unit test cases to the detailed specification. Yeah.
Yeah. In high level design, are BAs involved? Because generally, you told us, in SDLC, during high level design, BAs are not involved that much.
So you're not involved in design activities.
Yeah, but in detailed specifications, are BAs involved then?
No. So this is all a technical architect's job, these two. Only a
Okay.
BA is
In
involved.
both the stages, like BAs are not involved. We are just involved in requirement analysis, like
Yes.
writing the
Yes.
BRDs and all.
Yes.
Okay,
So
like the only stages that we are involved are requirement analysis and during testing. Maybe like
yeah, testing you do it more from a coordination point of view. We'll get more clarity when we actually discuss that topic. Right? When
okay.
you get to the testing chapter, we'll get more. So see, what we are looking at is how a V-shaped model works. So when I'm explaining this, I don't mean that you are doing these activities. I don't mean that you are doing your design and detailed specifications are not done by a BA. They are still done by a technical architect, but they have to ensure that they do it. Right? So similarly, your integration test cases. So making sure that these modules interact with one another. All those test cases are linked to your high-level design documents. And finally, your operational test cases, your functional test cases should be linked to your detailed requirements. Okay? Each requirement is tested thoroughly. Right? So that way you bring in more rigor. Okay? So only where systems are need much more reliability, you'll put in that additional effort to make the testing process, robust and comprehensive enough to meet all your needs. Okay, so that for those kind of projects, V-shape testing is done. Then you have prototype. So, like I said, if the customers are not able to visualize how the final product would look like, so they don't have any clue that my final system would look like this, right? It's difficult for them to sign off the requirements, right? Or even if they sign off during testing, they would say, you know what, this is not what I was expecting, right? So it will lead into a lot of back and forth discussions and unnecessary discussions happening. So we need to resolve them by ensuring that common understanding is established. How do we do that? We will do that by prototyping. Now what you do is, once you understand the requirements, okay, so you would go through these additional steps, right? So you do a quick design, you do the development, you take it to the customer, take his feedback, and then if he has any feedback, you'll refine it and then go through these additional steps. Okay, so maybe you create some screens like this, right? So you'll say that you could just, at the simple way, you could just draw this and then say your screen would look like this, right? So this will at least give that visibility to the customer, right? So you could draw wireframes to we call this as a prototyping, wherein we are trying to show the customer how his final product would look like. So maybe this is not very near to how the final product would look like, but at least it will both of you would gain a common understanding, right? So you'll agree on the layout and then the features that should be there on the screen and everything, and your final product should look exactly like this, right? So this is nothing but we are showing that during the requirements itself we are creating these screens and telling your final screens would look like this. Maybe the customer would say I don't want a the social integration here. I maybe want it at the top, and maybe you can move the subscribe and videos to the bottom. Okay, so he could have his feedback, right? So you will make that changes then, and finally agree onto this screen. So if you provide this to the development team, they could develop it exactly the way it wants. So this way you have established the common ground between the development team and then the business team. Okay, so this is nothing but we have done a
Raju, these prototypes and wireframes, are these necessary to be made in PowerPoint, or like you can use something else also?
There would be some tools also, depends on the organization which is using it. There would be, you could do it in PowerPoint, Word, Visio, or a simple sketch on a piece of paper.
Oh, okay.
Right? So you could just draw it on a piece of paper and scan it. Right? So if see, finally it's between you and the business team and the organizational standards which you have to adhere to. right? If the organization standard says no, all the prototypes have to be created in this specific software, then you'll have to do that in that particular software. If there are no such guidance, you could just draw it on a piece of paper. If both of you agree, then what is the problem, right?
Okay.
So it's purely context specific. So sometimes the customer would say that what, let's create a detailed one, or let's actually create this only the screen, right, without the underlying functionality. We call that as an evolutionary prototype. So in that case, you'll have to bring in a UI developer, a HTML developer, and actually develop that screen. Okay. So it depends. The level of involvement is different. We'll learn more about prototyping when we get into our requirement illustration, because that's one of the technique, right? So you have to clearly learn that process as well, right? So it's something specific to your role, because prototyping is something which you would handle, right? So you need to be aware of it. We'll learn about it in more detail. Okay. For now, I'm just telling you that this is one of the ways in which there could be a deviation. Otherwise, your standard SDLC would not have these steps. You will not have this additional 4 steps in a standard waterfall model or a typical SDLC model. Okay. So the reason why we are deviating it is to make sure that the customer and you both understand it in a similar way. Okay. Clear about this? Any questions till now?
Yeah, this prototyping is only for the customers or the design team as well? Like the IT team also will use these prototypes?
Yes. So see, it will act as a reference. Once you give this prototype, which is agreed with the customer, they have to exactly develop the same thing. Right? So it's not just for an understanding between you and the customer, but it goes to the next team also, and they have to stick to those formats.
Okay. So like I've heard like people build prototypes in HTML also. So the design.
Right. So we call that as evolutionary prototyping, and the one which I have just showed you in the screen, if you look at it, the 2 types of, this is more like a throwaway prototype, which means this prototype is of no use to us once the customer agrees to the requirement, right? So you have to again start it from scratch. But you have prepared a prototype like this, only the screen without the underlying features. So maybe all these buttons would not work, nothing would work, right?
Yeah.
So maybe not. So the backend logic is not there. Only the screen is what you are creating. We call that an evolutionary, because now you can use this screen and develop the backend logic, and all your effort is not wasted. It's evolving into the final product, so we call it as evolutionary. I'll explain more about it in detail when we talk about the prototyping illustration models. Okay. So we'll cover this in detail, because this is specifically involved with a BA role. We need to be very clear about how we would take up a prototyping session.
Yeah. Okay. Will you let us know like how to make a prototype, like a basic one on a PowerPoint or something?
Yeah, we can do that. I mean, but see, drawing them in a piece of paper. See, we need to understand the underlying logic. But
yeah,
if you need
that, like, everybody is so technical. They really don't want like anything on a piece of paper. They are always software something.
So PowerPoint, it's again as simple as just dragging and dropping stuff, right? So
yeah, I know that.
not your problem. Let's do that.
Yeah.
Do that. Spend a few minutes and see how we can create those things. All right.
All right.
Any other questions? Anything on the topics that we have discussed today? Is everything clear?
Who do a business analyst speak to on the other side? Like if I'm business analyst, whom do I coordinate with? The testing team and
see, during the phase 2, you would talk to the business team, right? So there would be the business users who would actually give you the detailed requirements. So you will talk to them, understand the requirements, and then you will pass on that requirements to the technical team. So these guys,
that's the designing part, like who do the coding and all. But so business team and the coding team.
Yes. So you will coordinate with all. So with the business team, you will understand the requirements from them. And if the design and development and testing teams have any questions, you'll clarify them. So you are basically the bridge between the business team and then the, the technical team. Okay?
Okay.
So from one person you are understanding the requirements, to other person you are explaining it. You are understanding the requirements from business and explaining it to the technical team.
Okay. Okay.
Okay?
So the longest process in this cycle would be the designing, like the designing and test.
Right. So, but your role would be a lot more in phase 2, wherein you understand the requirements. But this would take a little more time, and during this time, there's not too much work for you. Only in the initial stages of the project, a business analyst logs out. After that, it's all good.
Okay.
Right? So we just support these guys with some requirements or clarifications. Okay. Yeah. Any more questions? Anybody else?
So the requirements will be given by who? Like given by the project manager?
No, the business team. I explained you in the first session, right? So Pooja, you attended the first session?
I did, but I'm still a little bit confused.
All right. So there would be business teams who will actually be using the system, right? Now, if you take, let's say you're developing a software for your employees, right? Now, employees of one business unit. Okay, let's say there is a bank and then there is a retail banking unit, right? And then you are developing a teller machine for them. Simple requirement about logging into a system, right? So if you ask the business team, tell me the requirement, you would just say, no, you enter the user ID, password, login. That's it. Right? But is the requirement complete? So there are a lot more things that you have to work, you have to understand. So what if, what if the user enters an incorrect password? So do you have to log it after some times? What are the security mechanism? That's one requirement. So what if you forget the password? How could you retrieve it? Right? So that's another question that we'll have to ask. What is the registration process? What are the various mechanisms in which you can log in? Okay. What is the security features? Right. So all these things, have to be asked and then understood. Right? So it becomes a responsibility of the business analyst to ask those right questions. Right? Unless you ask the questions, the business users will not tell you. Right? So it is your responsibility to ask those questions.
So these business users are subject matter experts also?
Yes. They understand the business, but they will not know what is required from a systems perspective. From a business perspective, they will know. But from a system point of view, what all needs, that is where you would have to take care of.
So how we will identify, we will differentiate, like who is actually giving the requirement and who is the expert?
So I cannot cover everything in one session. Right? So we'll go in a methodical way. We'll pick up, each of the steps that have defined in the in the SDLC process, right? So we'll start from phase 1, phase 2, and then see what do we do as part of planning. Then how would we understand the requirements? Whom would we talk to? How do we document it? All that would be clearly, understood, right?
Today we have covered like three models. So we will be doing more models.
Yes. So there are a few more, like there is an iterative, spiral, product implementation. So next session we should complete it. After that, we will move into the actual role of a business analyst. So till now, I have not started explaining the role of a business analyst yet.
Okay.
So it's primarily we're looking at what happens at each phases, but how do we do it? We'll get to that, right? So once we start learning about the role of a business analyst, that is where we'll learn. Okay.
Okay.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thanks.